Showtime! Here we are back for part two of an interview with Aaron Sokol. You'll recall that he spent 5 years with the Oakland schools and now is completing an MBA at Haas with an emphasis on public education. When we broke off last time, Aaron, we were asking you about whether teaching will continue as a profession or it'll just be all, Teach America people doing it for a few years. And you were saying you thought it would always be needed, but there's a real budget crunch and a budget crisis that creates a problem. Talk about it. Tell me about that. What's the problem? It would seem to me teaching is one of the most important things that happens in our culture and society, and that it's got to find money. It's got to find resources.
Teaching plays an absolutely critical role in the way that we have built our society. As children grow up, they look for job opportunities, and what they need to succeed in the workplace and in college, if that's where they decide to go, is a set of skills, reading, math, and social abilities that they learn from teachers in school. That's the way we built our society. Unfortunately, there's really been two major trends over the last 5 years that have impacted our ability to deliver on that promise. Now, one is what's called the tragedy of the commons. This is a very well understood social theory that dates back to the Industrial Revolution in England. And the privatization of what used to be common land used for agricultural purposes. So,
right. In other words, every village would have what was called the commons, and anybody could use the commons to graze their animals. And then they privatized, put fences, and said one particular person owns it.
Right.
Okay.
So in America, for the last 20 to 30 years, public education has been experiencing a tragedy of the commons. What's going on is public education has been built as a public resource.
Right.
American taxpayers pay into the federal, state, and local governments with their income and property taxes.
Okay.
Then the federal, state, and local governments make decisions about how to allocate those resources out to private public schools. So what those federal, state, and local governments will do is they'll sit down with their policymakers and with their constituents, and they'll decide on an annual basis how much of this tax base do we want to give to the public school system. Should we raise taxes so we have more money? Should we lower taxes and make cuts? And year over year, these decisions impact the amount of money available to pay for teachers, school supplies, new buildings, and the upkeep and maintenance of the system that currently exists.
So what's happened? You're saying there's a tragedy here. What's the tragedy?
So over the last 30 years, Americans have slowly but surely decided that they only want to pay for their own students' education. If you look at the history of policy decisions, especially in a state like California, one decision after the next, Californians have decided that they want to fund their own local cities. So they want to pay for better education in their cities, but that they don't want to pay for education outside of their own communities.
I'm always quick to say the people who choose to vote, the ones who vote on whether to raise taxes or not, they're the ones who are saying, I just want it for me and mine, screw the rest of you.
But it's more than just voting, because in schools we have a whole second layer of parent activism and parent engagement that actually does have a strong influence on the way that school policy is set. So school boards run their own elections outside of the general elections. Active groups of parents will create bond measures to raise additional money from property tax revenues or from the local revenue base. And active groups of concerned citizens can actually have a strong impact outside of the electoral process on the way public school districts are run. Fundraising is a major way that this plays out.
And I guess what you're saying is the transition is from let's raise taxes across the board, across the whole population, and then allocate it to schools. And instead what we're saying is each little group is in it for themselves. What's the net result of that on the educational experience and the way work is organized? Who's going to do the educating?
So the commons in this example are the entire California public school system and all of that different aspects of that system.
Okay.
So there's pre-K, which is, preschool coming into kindergarten. There's K through 12, which is what we think of. There's post 12th grade public education options. There are summer programs and job training options. Now, the Commons was the entire California public education system from top to bottom that was being funded by public taxpayer dollars. And before the passage of Proposition 13, which I'll talk about in a minute, that passed in 1978, California had the best public education system in the entire country. Far and away the best.
Right.
And it was excellent in every city, in every county in California,
Right,
from top to bottom.
Number one K through 12, number one community colleges. That's the system I went through. Number one the university, number one Cal State. They were all superior. And I guess you're saying that's because the money was coming to it from across the entire state. Everybody was contributing money.
And everyone felt that it was a strong common resource that was there for the good of the state in general. So the tragedy of the commons, which is the first big major trend, is that Californians decided that they wanted to stop funding the system on a statewide basis, and they wanted to concentrate their own resources in their own communities, which is why we see such uneven placement of the top quality schools in California now.
In other words, where people have money out in the burbs, you get fancy school systems. In the inner city, where there's not a lot of tax money or tax base, you end up with schools that don't have the money to provide a superior education.
And I should qualify that. When I say top quality schools, I do not mean the best teachers or the best students. I do not mean that. When I say top quality schools, what I mean is the most money, right? So generally, when parents are looking around at schools, they want to see the schools with the nicest facilities, with the most sports programs, with the most after-school options, and the most summer school programs.
Is that necessarily the best education, though?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The best education is the school that meets the needs of the student. Different students have different needs, different schools have different strengths. But as a majority of Californian parents care about the schools that have the most resources for their students. And those resources, they come from the tax base and from the fundraising efforts of those communities.
Well, then let's talk a little bit. I'm trying to see, okay, what are work relations in education going to be like? So if you look, over the next decade, where you're going to try to do as much as you can with respect to improving public education, what happens? I mean, do we simply say, okay, we've got, 5 tiers of schools, these really are terrible and these are wonderful, and it's just going to be the way it is depending on what parents do?
So the second major trend that I need to talk about is Proposition 13, and that will bring me to that question.
Okay.
In 1978, Californians decided to enact Proposition 13. What Proposition 13 did was it limited the rate at which the taxes you pay on owning your house, your property taxes, could grow on a year-over-year basis.
And maybe even more important, it limited the amount of taxes you could collect from commercial property, from the big skyscrapers, from the corporations. They kind of rode along on the tail of homeowners, and homeowners wanted to limit their property tax, but the law ended up giving the corporations a giant break too.
Now you might think, well, that sounds fine. As long as it's growing slowly, there'll be enough money going back into the system to pay taxes.
Sure.
Unfortunately, from 1978 to 2008, California experienced the largest boom in property tax values ever in American history, ever. Now, our property taxes in that time period were going at between 1 and 1.5% a year due to Proposition 13. Our property values in that time were growing at between 6 to 8% a year.
Oh, so the value of the property is shooting way up, but nobody's paying taxes on it.
The value was skyrocketing, and the value of the tax base was climbing very, very slowly.
Okay.
What this meant is there's a huge gap between the amount of money that California should have been raising if we were running our tax base like other states, and the amount of money we were raising due to Proposition 13.
Well, let me draw back then for a moment from California, which is where your expertise is. Are there other states in the country where, because they collect the taxes, we're going to have good school systems and people who want to be in education maybe go to other states?
So the states that spend the most money on education are mostly on the eastern seaboard in the Northeast.
So we're talking Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut.
Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut spend almost twice as much per student as we do here in California.
Do you get better education?
Absolutely, without a doubt, on almost every metric. Now, there are some things California schools do extremely well, but those things are not generally a function of the amount of money that we give to our schools or the resources that we raise. So California schools have, a lot of them have extremely strong athletic programs. Now, they're underfunded, I should say. These athletic programs are badly, badly underfunded. But due to the strength of the athletic communities here in California and the number of students and families who view athletics as an integral part of their education, we have very strong football programs, basketball programs, soccer and swimming programs. But all of those programs are underfunded, and most of them are supported by the local communities that use those resources.
Well, so I guess the question becomes, we're trying to focus on, okay, how will work be structured? What will the relationship be of administrators to teachers to parents in the world of education over the next decade? I thought we'd be talking about technology and how technology would change it. And what you're really saying, hey, it's a pure dollars and cents situation. the technology is kind of secondary if you don't have the money to do it.
Well, so there's two things going on right now. The first is there are expensive technology solutions that when times were good in California, we could afford to spend. Now, Proposition 13, although it gutted all of the resources available for California schools, it required us to legislate other sources of funding that would go into the California schools. So what we decided to do as a state was fund our public school system with the capital gains tax. Now, the capital gains tax basically requires you to pay money on earnings in the stock market. If you are making money on investments, you have to pay a portion of those earnings back to the state, and they funnel those down to schools. So during the dot-com boom and during the housing boom of the 2000s, Californians were paying a lot of capital gains taxes. And this actually allowed our schools to get closer to a competitive level in the rest of the country. They never got there. We're actually, depending on how you count, we fund our schools at the 48th or 50th worst place in the entire union.
Out of 50 states?
Out of 50 states, we are one of the largest economies in the world, and we fund our schools at the 48th or 50th level in the entire country.
So what does that mean? I mean, I'm going to keep pressing you back to the focus of this course. What does that mean about the work relations that will happen within schools in California over the next decade? Are you just going to be, you just say, okay, schools are really going to be mediocre on the public level, and if you want to have a decent experience, you better go into the private, schools and the charter schools?
Absolutely not. That is not what this means. Now, it's easy to be pessimistic, to say, oh, well, the funding situation is so bad, nobody cares about schools outside of their own communities, how are we possibly going to fix this? But that ignores the reality. And the reality is that there are incredible teams of dedicated professionals working across the state and doing incredible things in schools. Now, this is not a part of the public education story that you're going to hear very often, because when it bleeds, it leads. The news story is about how bad the education system is and how many problems there are. If you see big popular education movies now, like Waiting for Superman, they're going to paint a very bleak picture of what's going on in the state right now.
Let's do this. Let's take a break. And then when we come back with the next little talk, what we're going to talk about is the positive side, looking at the positive side of the way education is going to develop in California over the next decade. Okay? And as we say, we'll be back after this.